Hello, I'm Sarah Manasra.
And I'm Virginal Darash, and this is Clarinet and Community.
A video series dedicated to clarinet, community, and belonging.
Welcome. Bienvenidos.
Greetings, clarinetists. During Women's Month, Clarinet and Community spent some time speaking to women who are part of the historical clarinet community. This is a community that embraces the sharing of knowledge and equipment in extraordinary ways, and these women have embraced and found their place within it. Our first interview is with Dr. Marie Ross. It was absolutely delightful. As someone who has not explored historical clarinets before, this interview made me want to dive right in. Dr. Ross, in the spirit of the community, is such an wholeheartedly generous person with knowledge and assistance. I really hope you enjoy this as much as we did.
Dr. Marie Ross in New Zealand was so gracious in celebrating and sharing with us her love of historically informed practice and really trying to find what the composers were saying and wanting to communicate at the time of the composition of the work. It's a joy to hear her share with us her experiences, her knowledge, her love, and you can really feel the radiance of excitement for this genre or period of music.
Good evening and welcome, Marie. Thank you for joining us. How are you? All the way from New Zealand.
Yes, that's right. I'm great. Thanks for having me, Bergie.
We are so excited to have you here. Me and Sarah have been like over the moon, just thinking about the work that you've done, and just want to jump right in and get to know you. Like, first of all, can you tell us about yourself and your journey in and through historical clarinets and what brought you to historical clarinet playing?
Yeah, that's sort of a funny story. I was studying at the San Francisco Conservatory, actually before we start, hi Sarah, as well. I was studying at the San Francisco Conservatory, hi, and I didn't greet you, hi. And I was doing a master's degree and I went to a repair shop to have my clarinets worked on. And it was the shop of Daniel Deitch, who some people may know. He was a famous repair person and also was into historical clarinets and making historical clarinets. And he had an original 5-key clarinet up on his wall of his shop and took it down for me to just play on, just randomly with a whole bunch of other clarinets, like metal clarinets and random stuff. And yeah, I blew a few notes on it and really loved it. It was a combination of the sound, but also how it felt creating that sound. And I had, of course, no idea about the fingerings or anything like that. So I was just sort of making odd sounds on it. But it was quite a feeling and an experience doing that. And of course, having the raw wood on your keys, on your fingers, and not so much metal keys, you know, and there's many less keys and many less inhibitions on that. So it was just very direct contact with the instrument, and much more intimate sound came out of it. And so, yeah, I was just immediately hooked. And what's interesting is from that moment to when I was actually had a clarinet in my hands and was learning how to do it was about 4 years. And that was not for lack of trying to get into it, but at the time, all the players who were doing it and the clarinet makers, none of that was on the internet, because it was Europe, this sort of old world Europe was very slow to get on the internet. And those people just didn't have websites and they were difficult to contact. And yeah, so it took quite a while to figure out where to go, where to get an instrument. Of course, I tried to buy that one, but he wouldn't sell it to me because he'd done a lot of work on it. And yeah, so it took a while, and it wasn't until many years later, I went to France and did a special course about historical clarinets for modern players, which was fantastic. And then I figured out where to go, how to get an instrument. And then I sort of had the horrific awakening, which was realizing that I had to be on a waiting list to get an instrument that took about 2 years. And that was horrible, of course, because I wanted the clarinet then. And as you know, some people may have experienced, it wasn't like just picking one off of the factory line. You know, you actually had to wait for someone to build it from scratch for you. Yeah, so it was a long journey, but yeah, one that was definitely amazing.
That's brilliant. And I love that. I love your response to the immediate feel of the instrument, the contact, the description of how you had to use your air, your fingers, like the immediacy of feeling like you're a part of making the music without the inhibitions of the metal. So that's a beautiful image. I just hope we can like capture that for a moment, because it's, you don't think about that until you do go over to, you know, the historical clarinet with less keys. So you're in New Zealand, and can you tell us about your work there? Because I know you're teaching. Tell us more.
Yeah, well, it's sort of an ideal job for me, because I teach modern clarinet, and I've got a studio of undergrads and postgrad modern clarinet players, but they also learn, a lot of them also learn historical clarinet. So we have that as a secondary subject. And it's interesting how much they learn about the modern clarinet by studying the historical clarinet for a semester or for a year, or some of them get more into it. But we're also lucky here, we've got a huge collection of early keyboard instruments, and we have a pretty big historical performance program. Yeah, it's quite interesting, it's quite progressive, and it's a great school of music. It's small school, small faculty, but all really, really good. And yeah, so it's interesting, as I say, seeing the students and how they respond to historical performance, especially because what else is interesting is we teach historical performance to undergrads really right off the bat. So from second year at university, is in their bachelor's degree, they're learning about things that I didn't learn about until I was studying for my doctorate. So it's quite cool to see how much that historical performance practice has started to become mainstream, so that even at a quite young age, students are learning about it and incorporating that into their modern performance.
It's really interesting that, you know, that at least in America, you know, obviously it's not as common to have historical practices being taught. Could you tell us just a little bit about the differences of the community, the historical community and the modern community, and then also like why, you know, why meld them together, and what is similar about them?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the first thing that everybody thinks of is historical performance focuses much more generally on mixing scholarship and performance. There's more of a focus on that than there has to be in the modern world. But you know, it's that, of course, those avenues are open to everybody, and what's interesting is seeing how the scholarship from historical performance and performers is seeped into the modern world and sort of influenced this level of scholarship amongst performers, and how that's changed really in the last, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, and how it's becoming much more prevalent, which I think is really a good thing. Yeah, so that's I think the most obvious thing. What's interesting for me is really the differences in lifestyle, if I can use, that's sort of a funny word to use, but for modern performers, there's one clarinet, and they focus on vast array of repertoire on that one instrument. And if you think about it, historical clarinet players, we have many instruments. So I've got about 70 historical clarinets. I've got a big collection, but yeah. Your face. Yeah, it's a big collection, but it's you know, a lot of them in Europe, you can buy them for like 20 euro. You can get an old clarinet, and it actually turns out to be something really good, but it's covered with green mold. And so if you take it home and, you know, figure out how to clean it up, you can actually have quite a good instrument. You know, Europe is saturated with these kind of old horns and stuff like that, so they're easy to find there. You just end up with a bunch of them. But yeah, it's we use a lot of different instruments sort of on a regular basis. So I mean, at one point when I was really freelancing in Europe, and even here, if I travel, I was travel before COVID, naturally. I was traveling back and forth between New Zealand and Europe and Australia, playing a lot of different historical projects. So we might play Chalumeau and one day, and then the next week be playing romantic instruments. And so it requires a lot of flexibility and of course, a lot of reed struggles, but even like magnified because you've got all these different clarinets and all these different instruments and naturally a lot of different reeds. But so it requires this flexibility and it requires figuring out how to practice and how to gain that flexibility of switching very quickly. And sometimes you even have to play different clarinets in one concert. So if, you know, they sort of choose different repertoire and then you have to play 5-key clarinet and then a romantic clarinet in the second half of the program sometimes, which is quite a lot because it's quite a different embouchure as the centuries go down. But yeah, so there's this lifestyle difference. And there's also, I think, a bit of a psychological difference because it's there's a lot more risk involved in playing historical clarinets. It's much less perfected. So with modern clarinets, of course, you know that when you push the button, this note's going to come out, right? With historical clarinets, my former teacher Eric Kopridge said, well, the first thing is getting a sound to come out. So it was even then, there's so much that can go wrong with it, that it's sort of always living on this edge of danger, you know, can go wrong with the mouthpiece because we use wooden mouthpieces and just tie the reeds on with string and everything's tied on with thread. And there's quite a lot that can leak. You have to learn how to play with leaking clarinets. There's a lot of the early clarinets, they don't have pads like modern clarinets do. They just have a piece of leather glued on to a piece of brass and it slaps on the key, right? It slaps on the hole. So it's so there's a lot of learning to get by with non-ideal circumstances, right? Whereas in modern clarinet, it's like we really train for everything to go well and to go perfectly. And yeah, it's really not the same as far as that's concerned, which is, you know, exciting, but it's another thing. I think you're not expected for everything to go perfectly all the time. I even have a recording, which I love, of the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment of the Grand Partita. And I think at some point you can hear a basset horn squeak on the recording, which is just fantastic, you know, it's because that's what it is, right? It's real life. It's getting all that stuff to seal is quite an adventure. But yeah, so there's a lot of differences of like you know, playing wise, just playing with orchestras. I think with historical clarinet, most of the orchestras in Europe are freelance and in the rest of the world as well, even more so than in Europe. In Europe, there's maybe about 4 or 5 that are not freelance, but that have fixed players, like Ensemble Mateus, where I played, is one of them. But even then, when I took the audition for that ensemble, my audition consisted of being called about 3 days before to play the first clarinet part in a Rossini opera, and then going to France on a train and playing with 1.5 days of rehearsal, massive solo in the overture, and never having rehearsed it with the ensemble. So just playing it for the first time on stage with a conductor that I'd never met before and a whole bunch of players that I'd never met before. And it was sort of like, well, if she can hack that, then we can have her in the ensemble. So that was really sort of like my audition trial by fire. But so it's very different. It's very different than you know, 250 clarinetists lined up in a hallway taking numbers and that kind of a thing. It's very much sort of on the go and always meeting different people and playing with different people. But that said, of course, the historical world is very small. So you meet the same people all over Europe, you know, because there's not that many woodwind specialists. But yeah, it's always a different experience and a different with different ensembles, which makes it really interesting. But yeah, it makes it very, very exciting. But everything I learned as a modern player about like having this, you know, perfect setup, the perfect reeds, the, you know, everything all planned out, you know, all my musical things all planned out. It sort of all went out the window in a way. for this sort of much more spontaneous, like off the cuff sort of lifestyle, is the historical player, which it just comes with the territory. But yeah, it is very different life, and very different mindset, playing mindset. And like I said, focusing on scholarship, I think even when you're playing, you think a lot differently about like phrasing and about these things than I ever did on modern. So it's yeah, it's really opened up my way of thinking, and it's given me a sense of freedom in my playing that I think I didn't have before as a modern player.
That's a brilliant segue. And full disclosure, I am on this journey of learning historical clarinet with Marie Ross. So everything she's saying, I'm just like, ah! Anyway, that is a great segue, because the next question I really wanted to know, and I'm sure other clarinetists who might be interested are wondering, what did you gain, learn, or discover, or even develop in your modern playing after you delved into historical practice and historical clarinet?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because when I was coming back to modern clarinet, I only did historical performance for about 10 years. So I didn't touch a modern clarinet in those 10 years. And for me, it was like, it's like learning another language, you know, like total immersion. Like if you're going to learn French, you go to France and you don't speak English, you know, it's the best way to learn. You know, it's sort of like people who find an English community, they never learn French, you know, but so it was like that. And I did only historical clarinet for quite a long time. And I think I developed this sort of fear of going back to the modern, like it's been such a long time. And I remembered having all these blocks against stuff, you know, like everybody builds up their mental blocks against certain excerpts or certain things that they find as weaknesses in their own playing. And so when I went back to it, I was shocked actually at how easy it came back and how much easier it was compared to what it used to be. And I think I was only benefiting from all those years of doing historical performance and gaining the flexibility, and also gaining yeah, just the flexibility of setup, of air, of all this kind of stuff. Yeah, maybe learning, thinking about music and thinking about even the technical things in a totally different way helped quite a lot. Just fingers being so much more flexible, and embouchure being so much more flexible, but also it's odd because I always think I have the same sound on every clarinet that I play. And I know I don't have the same sound, but it's the same physical feeling for me of making the sound. So I think that never really changed, but yeah, it's everything is quite different. Everything, I mean, technical aspects of playing. So the use of the air, use of the embouchure, fingerings naturally, but even use of how the finger technique is facilitated feels a bit different with the muscles and muscle memory. So but it's funny because everything just became so much easier, and those blocks that I thought that I had, mental blocks against stuff, just sort of disappeared, and everything became sort of just opened up, and suddenly it was like, wow, I can play all this stuff that I could thought that I wasn't very good at before. Yeah, and it's really interesting like that. I think it's just about learning how to play lots of different types of clarinets, and how that's going to be nothing but helpful, you know, and adjusting to yet another embouchure and another fingering system is just another clarinet. So it's been very helpful, and there's several things that are, I think, that are particularly helpful, like the breathing on historical clarinet. Historical clarinet will not let you play with a bad breath technique. So without very supported sound, no sound will come out. So you really have to support. And if you're not supporting on modern clarinet, you can still get a good sound actually. But if you're not supporting on historical clarinet, just nothing comes out. So it really forces you to support and to learn how to do that. And I think I learned how to do that in a way that I never did on modern clarinet before going to historical. And so it's really was a positive thing. And going back, I had to figure out how to play in 6 flats and 6 sharps again. But because on historical clarinet, we always play in F and C. But that's why we have so many clarinets naturally. Yeah. But even it's a different way of thinking, and it's a different way even of practicing. So it's quite interesting. Like yeah, so it's opening your mind, I think, is always quite useful, because in the modern clarinet, I think I'd gotten so sort of with blinders on about, this is how we play this excerpt in this music, and just opening that up, I think, was nothing but helpful. And actually, if you want to hear more about that topic, which I think is a super interesting one, that was, you can go to my Clarinet Fest presentation, which was all about that topic, mostly about technical aspects and reeds and mouthpieces, because of course all these reeds and mouthpieces are different, but about how you can gain sort of technical facility on modern from playing historical clarinet. And of course, there's the obvious answer to this question, which is that you gain a historical perspective as well. Sorry, it sort of left that. The most obvious one I'll leave for last. You get a historical perspective, which is how those players would have played this music. And a lot of the instruments themselves serve as a window to the past about how the music was being played. So when you get a chance to play on the instruments, you understand so much about how they were making sound. And then from that, you understand about how they were phrasing, because of course, all these things are interlinked. So it's since the sound is different, the phrasing was different, and how they were making music was different. How they were using the instrument as an expressive tool was totally different. And yeah, and you can even start to incorporate that a lot into your modern playing. And it's never going to have the exact same sound, but the concepts will be there. The concepts of the different colors of sound you can carry over quite easily into modern. So I think it's great for everyone to sort of experiment when they can with the historical versions of our instruments.
That's really it's convincing, and I guess I just want to interject and I've always been someone who has never thought much about historical clarinets. I've always just done this modern thing. But anytime I speak with someone about historical clarinets, I get really excited, and I'm like, I should do that. If someone, I want to interject. Yes, your Clarinet Fest is on clarinet.org. It's archived in the Clarinet on the blog. So yeah, I loved that presentation, and that was one that I fired me up, and I was like, I should learn historical clarinet. What would you? How
you should?
Yes. How does someone? Where do you recommend someone start if they want to use historical clarinet as a way to enhance their completeness as a clarinetist?
Yeah, well, like I said, mentioned at the beginning, it's buying a clarinet and doing that whole thing tends to be a commitment, because it's, like I said, a lot of these instruments are made by hand, so they're not pumped out of the factory. So they have to be, they're all sort of like boutique made. They're usually made by one man, instead of if you see the buffet factory, it's lots of makers. But they're made by one man, sort of. A lot of these makers have a couple of machines in their basement, and that's their workshop. And they make the whole thing by hand from a couple of machines, and a lot of hours with sandpaper. So it's a long waiting list, but that doesn't mean that people have to be bogged down by that. And I think if you just want to have an experiment with it and a play around with it, you don't need to go about it, but you're going to do it in the most professional way, because if you decide to do that, you can do that later. You know what I mean? If you just want to have an experiment with it, there's lots of ways. A lot of universities have historical clarinets, and you might not be aware of it. You might have to sort of ask people and hunt them down in a storage closet somewhere. So I remember I went to the University of North Texas for my doctorate, and I didn't know at first, but I found out later they've got 2 historical clarinets. They were up in a closet somewhere, and they hadn't been there. You had to dust it off. that hadn't been played for many years. But you know, when Dr. Scott found out I was interested in it, you know, he took them down, and but otherwise I would have never known, and nobody else really knew about them. So it's worth exploring that avenue. But also eBay is a really good resource, and there's a lot of clarinets on eBay that professionals would not play. So a lot of early clarinets. I'm talking about like 5-6 key clarinets, and you can get one off eBay for like $100 or a couple $100, because like I said, professionals aren't usually interested in playing those, because the first reason and only reason really is because they won't tune. If you know anything about the intonations from the period, what we use today is A equals 430. So usually we're playing an A equals 440 on modern clarinet in the States, or higher in Europe. But for historical clarinet, we use A equals 430. And for Baroque instruments, which is usually before our time, so Chalumeau though, or the two-key clarinet, would use A equals 415. So it's right in the middle. And that's randomly chosen. That's nothing historical, really. That's chosen by modern players who wanted to make sure that people didn't show up to the gigs playing modern instruments. So they chose another intonation that was not Baroque and not modern. It was right in between. But at the time, every town would have had their own pitch. And there's a really interesting book by Bruce Haynes on this topic called The Story of A. And it really is tracing pitch through this decades and through all of Europe. But it would have been that an organ builder built the organ, and then the instrument makers in the town built their wind instruments around the pitch of the organ, that the organ just happened. So you find historical instruments in 432, 433, 438, all kinds of tonalities. And so it's really hard to use very old original clarinets for professional use, because if you can't tune them at 430, it's not really possible. So but you can, there's a whole lot of these instruments floating around, especially old English clarinets that are in whatever pitch and that usually don't tune with themselves. But they're really quite cool for playing around with and for just, you know, getting and having a go playing Mozart or playing whatever repertoire you're playing, Stamitz or, you know, whatever, on these instruments. And I think my first clarinet, my dad had got it for me off of eBay, and it was a 6-key English clarinet, and it didn't have a mouthpiece, so I had to hunt down a mouthpiece for it and get a mouthpiece made, which was a challenge. But that was, you know, easy compared to getting home. The clarinet, I think it cost $200 on eBay. And it's really typical. You can go on there now and search for 5-key clarinet or search vintage clarinet or whatever, and you can find an old clarinet, and it's just worth it to feel how it feels, you know, as we talked about, under the fingers, but also with the air and how the sounds, how it responds to your air and to your breath and to your blowing, and, you know, how the phrases feel, you know, in that, with a totally different setup, and how the fingerings feel and things like that, how the cross fingerings feel. And there's a lot of resources online for fingering charts. You know, you can even Google it, go to all the resources like woodwind.org. It's all up there, and you can find all of that and just, you know, have a little experiment for a couple $100 on eBay. It's really fun to do. And you know, a lot of those, they're really easy to fix up by yourself. I was talking about the keys. They're just pieces of metal, and you take a piece of leather and you literally glue it onto the key piece where it touches the hole, and you've got a new pad, you know, so they're easy to fix up. They're easy to sort of, you know, they're sort of, you can't really mess them up. The only thing you have to worry about is them cracking, because the boxwood is delicate and cracks. But if if you just play it a little bit and you're careful, they're really hard to mess up. So it's a cool sort of experiment. And you know, if you get really into it, then you can, you know, figure out where to get a really good clarinet that plays in tune and all that kind of stuff. But that can come way later, you know. Just my recommendation is, if you want to just have an experiment, see if you like it, you know, but just look on eBay.
So your first step would be, if anyone's interested in hopping into the HP world, historical performance world on clarinet, would be just to source an
Yeah,
instrument.
we say historically informed performance, HIP. So the informed word is actually quite important because the word informed means to me that it's like we make our own choices based on the past, and it's not like, I'm not saying that I'm the authority, I'm making my own choice as an informed person, so it's that's interesting. But yeah, I mean, if my recommendation is, if you want to have a go at it, just have a go, so figure out where you can find a clarinet, whether that be going down to the pub and finding one that's been made into a lamp, and rescuing it, or you hear about these people finding these old clarinets in all kinds of places, going down to the pawn shop, going down to wherever. If you find an old clarinet, most of the places will be on eBay. There's heaps of people selling old, crusty, old, dirty clarinets that need some care, some love and care, which we could provide for them on eBay. I think that's a really easy resource. Universities have them. There are lots of places to be found. Sometimes music shops, they'll turn up, old clarinets turn up in music shops. I think there's one that sort of specializes in old clarinets somewhere in Kansas City. Anyway, but in Wichita maybe. But I think those are more expensive because they actually fix them up really well. So you just go to eBay, find something, make sure it seals, and then have a play on it, and you can play all your classical repertoire. What's funny is I get asked a lot of times, like, can you play the Mozart on those early clarinets? And it's like, yeah, it was written for those early clarinets, It's like people forget because and it seems like, when you think about it, it seems like such a silly question. But when you're there, it's sort of like, we don't connect that those pieces were written for these clarinets, and it's that it wasn't written for what we're playing it on today. And then to think about playing that piece on a clarinet with only 5 keys, it's wild, right? Actually, because the piece is quite complex. It's actually, the Mozart Clarinet Concerto is one of the most difficult pieces, I think, to play on historical instruments, just because it's quite complex. Especially if you think about it compared to Stamitz and compared to all these pieces. But it's like Weber. I think Weber, you play with 10 keys. And there's all those chromatic scales in Weber. And today's modern players are like, chromatic scales, they're coming all the time. What is this nonsense? But the reason why they had those is because it was quite virtuosic on a clarinet with not very many keys. Virtuosic to play chromatic scale. So it's it's an interesting project, summer project, just have a play around with it. I think there's only things to be gained.
That's brilliant. And it's funny because today I started looking at the first clarinet part in Mozart's Grand Partita, just that opening bit. And I'm like, and that little chromatic section, I'm like, this is hard. I'm like, it's a lot. And I'm like, they were doing this stuff? This is crazy. So I think there's a lot to be said about like the technique of the day. We think of Mozart as being technically very, fundamental. But when you think about the actual work, like just playing a B natural in the Chalumeau register is hard. So yeah, I love it.
And it's actually, if you want a real challenge, go to the last movement and play the second clarinet part. What's interesting is that the second clarinet parts in those pieces and in some of the operas, they're a lot more difficult. And of course, the reason is that was probably the part that Stadler was playing, that Anton Stadler was playing, and his brother was playing the first part. So his brother played all the beautiful melodies, and he was playing, all the left hand stuff and all the low register stuff. And so it's the second parts are quite virtuosic. And if you want a real challenge, try the second part.
That's unbelievable. So question, 2 questions actually. We talked about the benefits of, HIP and going to historical clarinet. Can you speak on any setbacks, if there were any, what those look like, how you overcame them, and then see if you can segue that into the realization of this great Brahms album you've recently released with the trio and the sonatas, how you overcame those setbacks and got into this Brahms.
Yeah, I mean, setbacks. Well, the first setback is to your wallet, of course. Oh, that's a joke. It's yeah, instead of having one clarinet, suddenly you need many. But yeah, it's I think setbacks for me were the same as they'd be for most people, which is basically just, I mean, I was going from I think after my master's degree, I was getting into like finals and St. Louis Symphony auditions, going from that to like being really thrilled about being able to play a C major scale. And my parents were looking at me like, what are you doing? You know, so this clarinet is like, she's happy to get the notes out on this thing, you know? So it was really like starting from scratch. And I think the challenges are going to be the same for everybody, at least every Brahms system players, right? Which is most of us, except for the Germans. And the fingerings, cross fingerings are a challenge. And even more than the fingerings is the way of blowing, the way of using the air physically is a challenge. But once you get through that, and it's funny because even when I went to study, I think I went through a period of intellectually understanding that I needed to use the air differently, but not being able to physically feel comfortable doing it all the time. So you go back into this modern playing of constant air sort of thing, because that's so ingrained, and it's so, the physicality is so much part of how we play as wind instrument players. So changing that tends to take time for people, I think for most everybody. But I think once you get through that and it becomes second nature, it's really like, yeah, it's really quite cool. And then you gain this sort of like superpower of having all this flexibility. But talking about the Brahms album, that the romantic clarinets are quite difficult, and playing on an original romantic clarinet came with its own set of difficulties. That has never really been recorded. I say really because it was recorded on original clarinets, but not of that period. And then it has been recorded on copies of romantic clarinets. But those are already like tweaked to be able to play in tune and things like that. So when you play on a real original historical clarinet, I played on an Oscar Erler clarinet, which is from Berlin. And Erler had ties to Richard Mühlfeld. And so it was really connected. And the A clarinet I have was played by one of the players in Bayreuth, where Mühlfeld was playing just a few years after Mühlfeld had played there, so by one of the other players. So I really knew the origins of that clarinet, which is cool. And I know the exact date of that clarinet, which is rare. Because usually you have sort of like at best a 10-year window of when the clarinet would be from, based on the key system and things like that. But yeah, but playing on those original clarinets from that period was tricky because the Germans at that time didn't really prioritize intonation. So intonation came second to the sound, and that was built into the instruments. It was how the instruments were built. They sacrifice, it's sort of, if you tweak an instrument to get one thing to be better or more how you want it, then you're giving up something else in return. So they had tweaked these instruments to have this big, massive, dark, beautiful German sound that we all want, right? It's just like what we think of when we think of Brahms. But in exchange, they'd given up the intonation, especially on a few notes in particular that are particularly out of tune, which, even if there's one or two notes that are really out of tune on an instrument, it makes it difficult to play, especially a piece like that goes through like, every note you hear on that album. So it was difficult because I didn't want to change the clarinet. I didn't want to tweak the clarinet, because that's what it was historically, is that they didn't absolutely prioritize the intonation. So it's wrong to sort of tweak the clarinet and make it into what we want it to be as modern players. So it was this conundrum of how to deal with that. And I think I sort of, in the end, I had to work out special fingering, special sort of embouchure techniques to get the clarinet to play more in tune. Because it's like this day and age, you just have to accept the fact that you have to play in tune, you know, and it's philosophically, you're not traveling back in time. It's not that you're doing that and you're not trying to make a recreation. You're trying, as historical performers, you have to think about what we're trying to do. I think for me, that was, it was to make something that would speak to our audiences, and that would be relevant to us, but that would also be true to the Brahms score and would be true to the Romantic era, and to that style. So and I think by being true to that, I think it's more likely to speak to modern audiences, actually. So those things were serving the same purpose. But yeah, so it's ultimately, I did, you know, for me, I prioritize playing in tune, because otherwise, you know, you wouldn't get anything off the ground today if it's not in tune. But it's interesting of dealing with those instruments that were from a totally different world and making them suit to our world, you know. So that was its own set of sort of things to think about, and challenges in that way to make the instrument work really at that level. But yeah, the phrasing and the style of the Romantic period, that's quite, I think that's quite cutting edge for where we're at in the historical performance world. Playing Romantic, of course, it started really with the Baroque performance, and it grew out of that into classical and beyond. And playing the very late works of Brahms is really on the edge of where we are at as historical performers, scholarship wise, and for performers to play in that style. It's really interesting. But yeah, it was a really cool experience. I think we played on a really really nice piano, really nice original 1875 Steinway, which was quite cool to play with, and it went with the clarinet really well. We tried about, I don't know, 20 or so historical keyboards at various places around Europe. And I went with my pianist, and we went and tried out pianos in lots of different places just to see which one went best with the clarinet. Just because some of them were too small, too early for the instrument and didn't quite match the sound. And because those clarinets are really from the time that the pieces were written. So the B flat was from 1890s. And the A is just a few years later, it's from 1905. But yeah, so it was really fun, and it was a really cool experience. That I prepared for that for about a year before we recorded it, which is like super luxurious, you know. Usually like recordings are really much more on the fly, but that one I really wanted to study and do the research and research into the style and get that one right. So yeah, it's cool.
It's a gorgeous album. For those who haven't heard it, I recommend you find it because it's gorgeous.
So you've mentioned a lot of different kinds of clarinets, and that you have a huge collection. And I know, you know, you can never ask a parent who their favorite child is, but I'm wondering, do you have any clarinets right now in your collection that you are particularly in love with? That, like, tell us just a little bit about like a few of your clarinets and you know, what makes them special to you?
Yeah, that's a really great question, but as you mentioned, a really hard one to answer. It's funny. One of the most special clarinets is the one I've already mentioned, this Oscar Erler A clarinet from 1905. And it's really special because it came from one of the players from the Bayreuth Festspiel Orchestra. But it had been handed down through generations of family. So it had actually, that player had sold that clarinet to a friend who was in the choir at the time, and who had also been an amateur clarinetist. And he had passed it down. He didn't have any family, so he passed it down to a family friend. and they had passed it down to their children, and they had it, and they'd had it in the attic for, I don't know, 20 years or something. And then eventually one day we're like, we're never going to play clarinet. Our kids aren't going to play clarinet. Maybe we should do something with this. And so they advertised it just on a German website for like used things, like where you find used bicycles and stuff like that, like not even a specialist music site. And I just found it because, you know, having insomnia in Europe, you just like search clarinets all night long. 4 a.m. I found it, and it was like, whoa. And it's got a very special key system. So I'm pretty sure it would have been a custom made instrument, because it was a combination of 2 schools of clarinet making. It was really an experiment from Oscar Erler. So it was with the left hand joint, he's using a special F key that was only used by Munich makers, but he also used the Erler mechanism in the right hand, which was his Berlin invention. So it was, what I imagined was, it was commissioned by a player who had learned how to play from Munich, and from that sort of Southern Bavaria school of clarinet making, and wanted those keys, but also wanted the newfangled invention, you know, on the same clarinet. So had ordered this clarinet special. And there's 2 of them in existence with this key system, A and B flat in a match. And I know who has the B flat actually. And he really begged me to sell him this A clarinet, and I was like, nope. But at least I know who has it. But I have never seen another clarinet like it with this system. Like I was saying, I think it's really custom made because it combines those 2 schools of clarinet making. And when I went to buy it from the family that owned it, I went there on a train in Germany, and I found out later that they'd had a lot of offers on the clarinet already. I think somebody a collector in Japan had offered them 6,000 euro for it. And I didn't find that out until later. And they hadn't listed a price on the website. So when I went there, I just like pulled out all the cash I had from my bank account and went there, and they were like, well, and they said to me, like, I said, well, how much do you want for it? Because I played it. And when I tried it, the mom of the family, she had one key was leaking, one pad was leaking. And so I said, would somebody come and close this pad for me? And she came, and she was like, she was just really taken because she could feel the vibrations of the instrument and like touching the instrument while it was being played. It was just like seeing somebody have that experience that had never been close to instruments while they were being played. He wasn't a musician. It was really amazing. And she just was so fascinated by it because it had been something handed down in her family. She'd never heard it played before. So playing that for her, it was really special. And she was just so touched by it and so moved by being in the room where it was played. And I said, well, like, I really love this clarinet. How much do you want for it? Thinking that it would be like insane. And she was like, well, how much do you have? And I was like, well, got just a bit more than 1,000 euros. It's all I have though. And she's like, that's fine, which is a really, really low price for such a clarinet like this. Like Erlers, they go for thousands. And so I was like, wow, that was lucky. And she told the dad drove me to the station. He told me in the car, like, we had an offer from a Japanese collector who offered 6,000 euros for that. And we didn't want to sell it because we really wanted to sell it to someone who was going to play it and who was going to use it to make music with. And that was really important to us. And before I'd come, they'd like checked out my website and like put my name into YouTube and listen to me play and stuff like that. It was really like, they wanted someone who was going to be a musician and who was going to play the instrument. Yeah, it was really remarkable. And they didn't care about the money. You know, they really did. That was totally secondary. And it's funny because there's so few people like left like that in the world, you know, but they were really, really special. And I was really glad to make that recording with it and send a recording to that family and say, like, this is what I made with the clarinet that's been passed down to your family. And it was so special to them. Like they had programs from Bayreuth, from the player who'd originally used the clarinet and all this stuff. And yeah, so that clarinet's always been quite special to me. And it's really a remarkable instrument. And you can, when I played it, I think when I first played it, I could really feel which fingerings the original player had used. This is going to sound wacky, but it was like some of the thing, like a clarion F, for instance, there's like 5 fingerings for that or something on a German romantic clarinet. And I could feel which one he had played, because one was like quite free blowing and all the other ones were like really stuffy. So I could feel like this player's technique. I could feel how he was playing on the instrument when I started to play it. It was so wild. It was like his technique was like built into this clarinet, because he'd obviously played it for so many years. It was really special. It's like you feel someone's there, you know, they're not there anymore. It's quite a special experience. But so that's always going to be, and then of course after recording the trio on the CD, that's always going to be one of my favorite clarinets when I answer that question. But also probably the basset horn, which is quite, you know, squonk squonk. The basset horn's really fun to play. If I have to name top 3, right? So you give me that. The basset horn, maybe like my 10 key historical, my 10 key boxwood clarinet, which was my first instrument and sort of my main go-to one. So I think those are probably my top 3 favorites.
Great. Yeah, I can't imagine having to pick a favorite out of 70. But every time you speak about your historical clarinets, I just want to go give it an experiment. I'm going to be on eBay probably tonight. You said something about the family that, you know, who had kind of felt you play this instrument and had a sense of kind of belonging. Like, can you tell us just a little bit about you know, the community of historical clarinets and the feel, like, what does it feel like to belong to that community? What's that world like?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like most things, too many players for too few jobs these days. So sometimes it can get gnarly, but it is like a small community, and it's a lot based on sharing instruments. So a lot of people, you know, they're borrowing, lending instruments even, which is really nice. I mean, you'd never lend anybody your modern clarinet. So it's a really different thing. You'd also never have any need to. But yeah, it's if you find your people, it can be really nice. And it's really nice to get together and play chamber music, play trios and quintets and stuff with other clarinet players. But I think ultimately it's just like the modern world, except smaller, you know. And you keep meeting the same people on gigs, but then again, you know, there's more and more people are doing it all the time, so it's something that's growing. And it's something that's becoming, I think, also in a way less specialized. So it's more and more modern players are sort of experimenting and learning about historical performance. It's becoming more universal, and there's becoming a more of an expectation that people do that and have some experience on it. But it is a lot based on sharing and getting, making friends and I had in Cologne, actually, I used to live in Cologne in Germany, and I think it's the biggest city for historical performance. There are 9 orchestras, at least when I was there. COVID probably destroyed a few of those, but there were 9 classical period orchestras, which is just massive, like in one town, you know. It's like, so there was really sort of the hotbed of all the clarinetists would go and move there. It's also quite central, so you could go to France, and you could go to, you could go north, you could go either way, anyway, go to Holland easily, you could go to all these places to play from Cologne. So it was there were a lot of us there, and that was quite nice, since we were all quite friendly and would meet and have dinner and drink wine and all that kind of stuff. Talk about things besides clarinet usually, but but yeah, it was really nice.
That sounds amazing. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I love it. I feel like we captured such a grand picture of your practice, your journey through historical clarinet into the modern clarinet, and how those have, informed one another. And to wrap it up, I just want to talk about one thing that stands out to everybody when they first meet you. And you can't tell right now because of the lighting, but Marie Ross is known for having a dynamic and colorful hair palette. And so can we just have like a minute to acknowledge your brilliant hair colors? Like even on the cover of your CD, this hot pink hair, it's gorgeous. What's the motivation? Where did that come from? I love it. Don't stop.
Well, it's funny that you mention it, because now this is my unfortunate normal hair color, which doesn't feel like myself. I've had it just, through being pregnant and stuff like that. You don't want to put chemicals on it because it can go through to the baby. So I've been forced to have my natural color hair for about a year now. But the colored hair, I used to, well, one year in 2014, I think it was, I played about 5 different Rossini operas with my orchestra ensemble Mateus, and for every single opera I had a different hair color just for fun, which was kind of cool. But it just feels more like me, actually. It just feels more natural, and it's I would tell people that's my natural hair color, but it's yeah, it's just it was something that I'd been wanting to do since I was a kid, and never sort of do it because for this reason or for that reason, I just never done it. And I was sort of afraid to do it, oddly. It sounds weird to say that now after having done it for so long, but I was sort of afraid to do it. Like, how will people react? And one time I was just like, forget it, I'm just gonna do it. I woke up one day and I was like, today's the day, just out of nowhere. And so I did it. Yeah, and then it felt so much more like myself. Like, this is me, this is my hair color, like this is how I feel like I should look, it was odd. And I felt finally like I looked the way that I should look. And so I just kept doing it. And it's funny because it's a nice it's like a nice icebreaker, and people come in the street, come up and talk to you. And when I finished my doctorate in Texas, I had pink hair like that pink color as well. And like women, these sort of like Texas women, with a big hair, they get, oh darling, I love your hair, and stuff like that. Like they come up and talk to you in the grocery store. It's just really fun. It's just really like, I just like to that feels like me, and having this sort of mousy color doesn't feel like me. So it's like, your inner pink. Everyone embrace their inner pink hair, well, like your hair is quite cool as well.
Well, it's what it is. It's your outside matching your inside, right? The the vibrancy and color and joie de vivre that you have internally is now being shown through the vibrancy of the color of your hair, and I love it. I think that's a perfect place to say thank you so much. You have been amazing, Marie. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I am always inspired when I hear you talk about historical clarinet, and I'm definitely going to be checking out eBay.
Yeah,
it's time.
Yeah, you should. And when you have any questions, Sarah, let me know.
Absolutely. You're such a wonderful resource and so supportive of other clarinetists, bridging the gap between the two, and people in the community and out and welcoming people in. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And just to say, for everybody out there, I'm on Facebook or whatever. If anybody wants to come and chat about clarinet stuff, just hit me up. I'm always happy to talk about historical clarinets. So
and check out her CD.
Thank you, Virgie. Thank you, Sarah. Really nice to talk to you.